Spoštovane gostje, spoštovani gosti, dear guests. First, I'll make a small introduction in Slovenian, and then I'll switch back to English. Lepo pozdravljeni nocoj v drugem dogodku, spletnem dogodku Slovenskega filozofskega društva, ki smo ga poimenovali Filozofija v matrici. Veseli me, da ste se nam znova pridružili. Še enkrat bi vas opomnil, da se tale reč snema. Danes nas veseli, da imamo v gosteh dr. Andreasa Oberprantacherja iz Leopold-Franzens Univerze v Innsbrucku. Več o njem bo povedal Gašper Pirc, imel pa bo svojo predstavitev oziroma predavanje v angleščini. Zdaj, če boste gosti, tisti, ki nas spremljate v živo na Facebooku, imeli kakšno vprašanje, ga lahko zastavite tudi kot komentar in ga bomo skušali na koncu prebrati, dati gostu, ostali pa se boste seveda lahko vključili v debato po predavanju. So, I would like to welcome Andreas Oberprantacher. He is from Leopold-Franzens Universität in Innsbruck. He comes for Institute für Philosophie, so that's Institute for Philosophy. Hi, Andreas. Gašper will introduce you shortly. I just want to say hi to all other guests that also come. Some of them come from abroad. Also, those who are viewing this on Facebook, if you have any questions or comments, you can write them below under our live stream, and we'll try to pass that on to our guest at the end of the session. Also, others that are participating in the Zoom session, you are too invited to join our debate at the end. I only have to remind you again that we are recording this session and that it's, of course, broadcasted live on Facebook. And now, I'll pass the word to our Vice President, Dr. Gašper Pirc, to further introduce Andreas. Herzlich willkommen. What I did forget to say is that this is the second event in our Philosophy in the Matrix series. Our events are now broadcast live on Facebook, and they're being held in Zoom, because that's the only way we are allowed to gather now virtually. And I did read some of the introductory stuff that's listed on Andreas' website, and I'm sorry, the cat is again trying to participate in our Philosophy in the Matrix session. And I saw some really interesting topics there, not only about the private property, but also about phantoms, refugee, migrants. So I'm really curious what Andreas has to say. So, Gašper.
I'd like to welcome you as well to the second event in our new Philosophy in Matrix series. It's been quite some time after our previous event, but in the year that is expiring, we are all a witness to a situation most of us have not yet faced. And everyday life is directed and complicated by an external intruder in form of virus, which has placed before us a mirror of some completely different society, of a new reality that seems to remain our exclusive perspective for quite some time. And it seems appropriate, given the situation, that at the Slovenian Philosophical Society, we have tried to put some spotlight to the topics that are sometimes marginalized or even overlooked in the current society. So I'm very glad that we will be given a lecture by Professor Andreas Oberprantacher, Associate Professor at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Innsbruck. His most recent publications mostly address migration and refugee from a phenomenological and genealogical angle. And his research combines social and political philosophy with links to aesthetics and philosophy of technology and media. So I'm really glad that I could invite Professor, who is also a supervisor of my research project here in Innsbruck, to be our guest. And hopefully now everything will be as it should. Professor, I would like to give you the word right now. So please.
Thank you so much, first of all, to you, Gašper and Tomasz, for this event. It's a pleasure being here, wherever here is at the moment. And I guess that also in terms of these digital appearances and disappearances, this would be a topic per se that we could discuss in such a context. I would like to start with some very, very preliminary thoughts by, first of all, repeating some of the words of René Magritte and by saying this is not a talk. So what I'm going to present here is definitely no formal talk. It's more like a concern that I'm sharing. It's not a concern that reflects my specialty. If I have something like a philosophical specialty, it is definitely the case that in the last few years, I was focusing mainly on the intersection of refugee studies and migration studies from both a phenomenological and genealogical angle. So by saying this, I would like to mention that when I will be addressing the right to property and to what extent it can be justified, that this does not necessarily reflect the work that I've been recently doing, even though to a certain extent I was touching on this very issue the moment I was also addressing the very question if we can refer to the territory of a state as something like a property, because it seems to be the case, especially in normative political theory, that many argue as if a state should be considered like a property that can eventually also decide who gets allowed to get in and who needs to be deported somewhere else. So the very questions of boundaries, of borders, are very often reflected in terms as if the state was somehow the property of the people who rightfully live on a certain territory. And I think this is a very problematic assumption that seems to me very questionable. It can also, to a certain extent, be traced back to early modern debates in the context of property theories. And this is, in a way, my own personal link to the issue of property. But when it comes to the contemporary situation, my concern is a slightly different one. What concerns me as an ordinary person is that even though we are being promised that in the next months or so, a distribution of vaccinations will take place, and only recently we were informed that one pharmaceutical company after the other has successfully completed all the trials, and that millions of vaccinations will be prepared shortly. What concerns me is to what extent can this be sold, distributed as a property that belongs to some pharmaceutical companies. Obviously, these pharmaceutical companies have an interest in arguing that they are not necessarily interested in making any money out of this. It's more like an act of let's say, global cooperation and an effort to come back to some kind of normality. And they are certainly also using this pandemics as a strategy to promote their own products by arguing that, at least in this case, they have no strong interest in selling it to the best, let's say, to the highest bid possible. But nonetheless, the issue that I think is a relevant philosophical and not just a philosophical issue is how come that such a vaccination can even be conceived as a company's property. This becomes, to my opinion, even more complicated the moment we are talking about pharmaceutical procedures that in a way create an extra value out of a certain natural resource. So there's a certain trend in the last decades towards what some people have called bioeconomy or biocapitalism, where property rights, traditional property rights, through the instrument of a patent law, are inscribed into life forms. This can be genetically modified organisms, but it can be also other life forms. And I guess that the situation that we are in the midst right now is reflecting this. So my concern, my initial concern, if I may call it so, is that there is a certain trend towards a form of biocapitalism and bioeconomy that accumulates and transforms a lot of natural resources and exploits in a contemporary fashion these resources by distributing them quite unevenly around the globe. So against this background, I tried to reflect on some of the initial legal and political theories about property rights that ever since Hobbes and Locke discussed property rights became a major part of the legal and political philosophies of the early and late modernity. And it is, to my opinion, comparatively evident that all the social contract theories, starting with Hobbes to Kant and so forth, are intimately connected to the very question how a society, how a civil society builds upon individual property. So I guess it's not a coincidence that ever since Hobbes to Kant, the discussion of property is crucial for any argument that concerns the establishment of a civil society. So these property theories are not just a footnote in the history of the social contracts, but they are a key element to understanding their establishment and their proliferation, also the debates, the different arguments concerning these social contract theories. What I find particularly interesting in this context is that property is indeed something like a crucial keyword in this period of early to late modernity, since property as a term is not just reflecting economic processes, but it reflects also legal processes, political processes. But beyond that, it extends also to concepts of ownership in even psychological terms. Thinking about some of Kant's arguments, we see that his idea of autonomy, in German it's usually Selbstständigkeit or Eigenständigkeit, translated as autonomy, is intimately connected also to the very question of property. So we find that a lot of concepts that have been very influential in early to late modernity are in one way or another connected to property. So property as a term is not a one-dimensional term. It is a term that has a multiplicity of meanings, a multiplicity of uses, but it's certainly some kind of keyword that reflects this transition from early to late modernity, from moving away from very hierarchical, also transcendent conceptualization of social relations in terms of a city of God that is transcended, and let's say natural reign on this earth towards a civil society. And compared to the discussions that have been taking place between Hobbes and Locke, what I find particularly interesting is Kant's effort to ground the idea of property, not by referring to any kind of work or to labor, as Locke did, who tries to argue that we can appropriate something simply by working on it or by using our labor forces. So he refers to our hands as that what transforms something into our property, by obviously also limiting this accumulation by arguing that we have no right to own more than we actually need, something that is perhaps also quite often neglected in the context of Locke's approach to property. What I find particularly interesting when it comes to Kant is that he doesn't refer to any kind of labor or work, but he tries to reason about the necessity to accumulate, to appropriate something in order to make a civil society possible. So in that work that in German is called Metaphysische Anfangsgründe der Rechtslehre, that has been translated into metaphysical elements of justice, and to some commentators, it is quite likely that this part of the metaphysics of morals, when it was published, became messed up because some of the parts don't really fit to one another. And it could be the case, as some argue, that the original structure by Kant was slightly different from the one that was eventually also published. And this might also be one of the reasons why some commentators like Hannah Arendt came to the conclusion that it's quite boring. But properly read, I think it is quite an explosive text. It is quite explosive because Kant states his argument by first of all suggesting that nobody from the very beginning rightfully owns anything on this planet, but the planet itself, the surface of the planet, is owned by everybody. So he argues that it makes indeed sense to start from the very presupposition that nobody has any particular individual entitlement to anything on the surface of this planet. But he introduces a strange law, and he calls this law a lex permissiva, a certain permissibility where our reason compels us to start an appropriation process. So it is reason that commands us to start owning something. He uses also the Latin term appropriatio, appropriation. So what Kant tries to convey here is a kind of a philosophical fable, a philosophical narrative, where at the very beginning, the planet Earth, where we were scattered around, but not in eternity, because since it is a globe, we will eventually also touch upon each other. It is reason that compels us starting this appropriation process by simply calling something mine, and others are calling something else also theirs. So the primitive vocabulary also used by Kant is mine and yours or thine, a vocabulary that has already been used by Hobbes and which is in a way also being appropriated by Kant and put into a new context. So Kant assumes also that from the very beginning we will have some kind of conflicts, not just of interest, but conflicts about who rightfully owns what I call mine and what another person calls his or hers. And Kant's strategy is quite simple, since it goes in the direction that in order to overcome these conflicts, we are eventually also compelled to institute that what he calls the civil state as that entity which in a way adjudicates these conflicts of interest by also compelling us to accept certain adjudication process. So it is out of this necessity to call something mine that is nonetheless also a part of my reason that compels me to call this mine. The civil state is being created in the context of Kant's arguments. So it's almost like, how could I put it? Almost like a mythical process where out of an originary conflict over property, all of a sudden the state, the civil state, emerges as the solution to this property conflicts. What interests me, especially in the context of this philosophical fable, is that it's perhaps not a coincidence that Kant rejects any kind of historical reasoning. In fact, there are some passages where he says that whenever one wants to look closely or give a close attention to the very historical process of how states came into being, about how appropriation took place historically, then this person is not anymore part of the civil society, but this person is ex lex. It is a person standing outside of the law, a person that can be annihilated. These are some of the words used by Kant itself. Quite strange for his otherwise quite reasonable argument. It seems that history itself presents such a problem for the legal theory of Kant, which is directed towards future as that horizon of justice that should eventually try to balance this initial injustice, this initial violence of appropriating something, that whenever a person tries to look back at the historical process of appropriation, that this person needs to be not just marginalized, but this person needs to be annihilated because it is posing a threat to the very philosophical fable that Kant tells us. And in general, it's probably not a coincidence that most philosophies of property are trying to be quite ahistorical, because history itself, especially in this period that Karl Polanyi has called the Great Transformation, it is not a period where people are owning, but where many people, where masses are being disowned. So it is also historically probably not a coincidence that these property philosophies start to emerge almost the second where in this transition of the medieval society, we find that a lot of walls are being erected, a lot of fences are being erected, where more and more commons are disappearing, and where people are basically being disowned. So it is a strange perplexity, almost a paradoxical situation, that these philosophical theories seem to suggest the importance of property, more or less at the same historical time where many people are in one way or another disowned. A form of disownment that happens in many parts of Europe, but obviously elsewhere too, not least in the 18th and in the 19th century, if we think also of colonialism and imperialism, or the accumulation process of modern slavery. So there seems to be some kind of connection between these legal and political philosophies of property and a historical process where masses of people have been disowned in one way or another. What I'm trying to suggest here, also along the lines of a certain Marxist and perhaps also post-Marxist reading, is that the philosophical focus on theories of appropriation and of property, in a way historically neglected, perhaps couldn't even realize what kind of accumulation was actually taking place. So there seems to be also some kind of tension between the term used in the context of philosophy, appropriation, and that term preferred by Marx, who speaks of a primitive accumulation, because what eventually has taken place is not an appropriation that gave rise to a liberal sense of ownership, but an accumulation that disowned masses of people. And as Marx has said, it is not a coincidence that these philosophical fables usually tell quite an idyllic story, a story where there were two groups of people, those that were lazy and those that were industrious. Those that were industrious were able to own something. They could create property for themselves. And the other people were just the lazy bums who didn't engage in this process. And therefore, it's basically their own fault. But violence, as Marx says, is quintessential to any process of accumulation. And as long as philosophical theories are not able to address this violence of accumulation, then they are in a way legitimizing also silently this process itself, even though they are focusing on legal forms of entitlement. What is the sense of this concern that I would like to share here? Is that this initial philosophical theories, not least that of Kant, gives us little opportunities to criticize any kind of historical process, because it is directed towards the future. So the only possibility that it would have is to argue that this future justice has not been realized yet, that we need to reform more in order to obtain this justice for more people. But it allows us, or it gives us no opportunity to criticize any kind of past violence and to right any historical wrong. And if it is the case that this philosophical theories about property confused appropriation or spoke about appropriation, whereas an accumulation has taken place, where does this leave us nowadays? Well, first of all, I would also say that a new form of accumulation is taking place. An accumulation that, unlike that discussed by Marx, of land, also of people, takes perhaps a slightly different form, or quite a different form. We could perhaps speak about the contemporary accumulation as a form of genetic accumulation, where the medium nowadays, the control over the means of production is replaced by the control over patents and copyrights. It is probably also an accumulation of intellectual capital too. So I would say that the accumulation that is taking place nowadays is probably quite different from the historical accumulation addressed and criticized by Marx. But at the same time, we see also that in order to confront ourselves with that what is taking place with this accumulation process, the historical philosophies of property rights and the efforts to justify property in legal terms gives us little opportunities in this case too, in order to address that what is taking place nowadays. Because be it Locke's conceptualization of property, be it Kant's conceptualization of property, these are concepts of property that reflect little of those property rights that are being obtained, accumulated by the pharmaceutical companies. And this, in a way, would also be, to my opinion, a good moment to return to the issue of property by keeping in mind that what has been called appropriation in a historical sense, more often than not, corresponds to accumulation. And this is the concern that I wanted to share here with you. Thank you.
Professor Oberprantacher, vielen Dank für einen tollen Vortrag. Thank you very much for this great lecture. I think it was really interesting and really urgent today, because we are definitely living in a world where the questions of property needs to be raised in a different, again, in a different vocabulary, even not just with a different way, different manner. So, and I do think that, going back to kind of Marxian understanding of property is definitely definitely not the move we need to take. We need to look for revisions on what to understand under the term property, so on. So I wouldn't go too much about this because I'm sure that Professor will be able to expound upon everything that he said already even more. So I would like to invite everyone here, and also of course everyone on Facebook, to write a message, to either comment live or just write questions so that we will read it to Professor Oberprantacher. So I would now like to ask if there anyone who already has a question for our guest.
I have one question if there are no other questions. Just to warm us up, and because Rana is also here, and the question that comes to my mind is the following, Andreas. Do you think we could also say that animals could be disowned by this idea that everybody that actually lives on the globe, that you mentioned, that by virtue of being on the globe, you are actually co-owner of the space? Now, of course, animals are not in such a way a part of human society, but still, would it make sense to say that they are disowned in the process of appropriation? And the follow-up to that, could we even say that perhaps the environment could be disowned? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much for this question. I think if we move away from a very modern and to a certain extent also very limited conceptualization of autonomy that is at the base of, for example, Kant's approach to property, we would then also be able to consider other living, perhaps even non-living beings in terms of property rights. We know definitely also in a very narrow legal sense that there are property rights extended to certain objects, that even if I own these objects, I cannot simply destroy them because they are considered works of art. So certain rights definitely extend to objects. This is part of also of our legal traditions, so it would not be that far-fetched. What could be relevant to this question is that Hannah Arendt tried an alternative justification of property in a very political sense. She argued that in political terms, to own property means to have access to a world. She argued that property is quite relevant, and she said that property should not be mistaken with any kind of capitalist accumulation. It is that basic good which allows us to relate to others, to the world itself, to make experiences. And in historical terms, what she criticized also as forms of worldlessness were those moments where people were expelled, where people were deported, so where people lost this property in political terms. And I think it would have not been Hannah Arendt's intention, but it might be possible to translate some of her arguments and to consider also habitats, environments, as places that are all the beings' property that live in this area. Obviously, we have many beings that are nomadic, that do not necessarily just share one particular place, but many. But it would definitely an effort to start somewhere.
Thank you very much. I think this is a really enlightening venue to approach this issue.
Thank you very much. Is there any other question? If not, I also have one before the next The next question will arise. I would just like to follow up on this because I think this is a really, as already Tomasz said, really interesting venue. I would like to go in a bit different direction. We just had this discussion previous week, and also the Day of Philosophy 2020 actually especially considered the questions upon artificial intelligence, of course, post-humanism, transhumanism. So the question, obviously, that starts from this is this right now in 2020, we are obviously, we have changed our way to how to approach and how to use technology. Technology has become really a relevant part, a critical part of our lives. Even now, as you see, the issues we have are connected to the question of, I do think, and maybe if you can continue on this line, is actually here, do we need to understand property, especially as, in a way, not like owning something, but maybe as a power to manipulate to the situation right now, and how will this property be understood when it comes to artificial intelligence, when it comes to maybe new technologies that come by. So this is one part, because I would like to add this, because we know that, of course, Hegel considered property as kind of, let's say, embodiment of person's attempts to develop one's powers, and come to self-consciousness. So obviously we can't understand property in this type anymore, which was still prevalent for most of the thinkers, but especially in this intellectual property sense, perhaps. So,
I mean, since this is more like a concern, it's certainly not more than just a tentative answer that I could give, more like an effort to briefly reflect on which direction I would perhaps try to follow up, first of all, in the context of your question. I would think of, first of all, of Marx's argument that the capitalist accumulation is always already a transformation of natural resources, where an extra value is being created. So capitalism, as he understood it, is not just leaving things as they are, but the accumulation transforms them also, adds some value to it in order to manipulate nature right from the beginning. So the moment everything becomes a potential resource, it becomes also objectified. We are already speaking about experiences of alienation, not just in terms of the workers, but also of the relation of the workers to that what they are working on. So I guess that the issue of manipulation has always been already part of a certain capitalist critique of capitalism by Marx. We could then address the question, what kind of manipulation, what kind of transformation are we experiencing nowadays? Again, this is more like a very associative answer. I don't think it's a coincidence that if you take Jeff Bezos, or if you think of Elon Musk, that these are perhaps also the driving figures to a multi-planetary colonization, that in terms of this, let's say, venture capital that they have accumulated, that they are thinking about accessing further planets, of moving beyond the limitations of planet Earth and elsewhere, on planets where there are no traditional limits to accumulation and to owning something. So that on one part is, to my opinion, quite an interesting phenomenon. And the other phenomenon connected to it is that when it comes to artificial intelligence, as I understand it, most forms of artificial intelligence, most neural network are being developed on the basis of traditional commons, let's say large libraries that have been transformed into databases. So the very basis of artificial intelligence systems as neural networks are working or are extracting knowledge that is in a way common historical knowledge, common linguistic knowledge. So that the very database at the basis of artificial intelligence is something that would be part of the, let's say, the cultural heritage of humanity. And they are transforming this cultural heritage of humanity into something new, into a new commodity, into a resource that is being sold back to us, but on the basis of that what nobody should or nobody could own. So yeah, this would be new forms of manipulation. My answer is at best tentative, but I think that new forms of manipulation, new forms of transformation are taking place, and they are sometimes taking something that has not been accessed by anybody so far, or they are accessing that nobody could own so far.
Thank you very much. I think this was very enlightening. Maybe now I will ask again if there's any other question. If not, perhaps here I see. So Reingard, yeah, I see the question here, of course. Please, Reingard.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Andreas. That was very illuminating. You make me associate your thoughts with an issue that I'm trying to deal with, and that is ownership as a psychological phenomenon. And there seems to be an inverse relationship for me between property in the sense of owning something as an object on the one hand, and ownership of experience on the other hand. If you turn somebody into an object that you have certain rights to, my hypothesis is that then your ability to experience and to own your own experiences diminishes. Is there something in, it sounded to me, but I'm not an expert on Hannah Arendt, whether she talks about that when she talks about worldliness?
I think this is obviously one of the most precarious connections that one could make between humans and non-humans, that the history of slavery, where people have been objectified, where in legal terms they were not considered to be fellow humans, but objects, that there is definitely this, let's say, this negative link between some humans and some non-humans that were both objectified. Hannah Arendt does not refer to animals except in a few minor places, but it's not really a concern to her. But she definitely refers to the history of slavery, also in a quite ambivalent fashion. But what is quite clear to her is that people that are being objectified by, well, becoming slaves, by being enslaved, or by being reduced to job holders, this experience is also an experience where people are being disowned, not just of the things that they possess, but of a certain, let's say, potential to experience, to access world, to share world with others, to act and to speak with others. So this process of objectification is discussed and problematized in a phenomenological sense, that to appear to others means to experience some kind of freedom. But if this freedom is being taken away from you because you're being objectified, because you are being limited, and the initial freedom for her is always the freedom to move, to be able to act and to speak. The moment this freedom is being limited, then you have at best a partial access to a worldliness, or at best some kind of memory of that.
Where would I find that in the work of Hannah Arendt?
Mainly, not only, but mainly in her book, The Human Condition, in German, Vita Activa.
Ah, okay. I should be somewhere here.
Thank you, Reingard. Here we have another question from Facebook. Dr. Uroš asks, I was wondering if Professor Oberprantacher could perhaps comment on the question of property in the light of slavery. We kind of started a little bit, but the background of this question mainly concerns Locke's ambiguous relation to slave ownership. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, this would be a very interesting, let's say, work that I would love to consider doing. I mean, a lot of work has been already done, to my knowledge, on this issue already. I'm thinking of Domenico Losurdo, who criticized at least part of the history of modern liberalism by showing that liberalism was never that liberal when it came to debate slavery. So not just in let's say in very specific terms that there were liberals that owned slaves, but that in fact also part of the liberal tradition was quite open to justify, at least in part, the enslavement of people. I think that the strategy, as I recall it, of John Locke in his two treatises of government was to suggest that, well, I mean, we can think of the slavery in the United States as something that came about because the people that were enslaved lost an existential war, and so their right to life, which is a natural right to possess oneself, well, disappeared, and it was handed over to those who won the war, and these were the future slaveholders. So John Locke, as I recall his argument, tried to justify with his own philosophy the slavery by creating this fictitious account of a war between populations where the whites prevailed, and since they prevailed, they, in a way, were entitled to decide over the life and death of the enslaved people. So what is nonetheless the consequence of this is that it became compatible for Locke with his otherwise liberal approach to rights, to still accept the fact that in the United States there were slaves, and that in other parts of the world too, let's say modernity, built upon the enslavement of people. So this is just one of the examples could be given, but in general, I think it's worth also to remind ourselves here that the very tradition of political philosophy started with efforts to justify in one way or another slavery, and that this tradition continues all the way even to Hannah Arendt and her, let's say, very difficult approach to the civil rights movement in the southern states of the United States.
Thank you very much. We are still quite on schedule. You can, of course, the one that does have a question can.
I do have a comment. I think this is really a really very good discussion that we are having here. And I just want to comment on two things. And also maybe, Gašper, I would suggest that you keep your camera off because there are some problems with the connection. So one of the comments is the following. Somewhere I read that Locke's labor theory of value and of property was actually, at least in part, a consequence of him being a shareholder in those early colonization companies. So that in part, actually, his idea of labor instantiating property was a justification of British settlers coming to the USA and actually taking the land from nomads that didn't really do anything. So I think I remember in which volume this was, but unfortunately I can't really remember the exact title of this chapter. So I think that would this argument would precisely fit with what you wanted also to say, Andreas. And then the other comment that I want to make is that when you have this disproportionate relationship between the owner and somebody, let's say a person or a subjectivity, to be more universal, that is disowned, Freire's idea here is interesting. Not only does the life work, the Lebenswelt of the disowned individual diminish, but also the life world of the owner, of the conqueror. Why? Because you all of a sudden have this unequal relationship in which you can't really have a good mutual recognition. And so that's why I think Freire actually speaks about mutual liberation, that not only, the suppressed or disowned individual can be liberated by a more equal relationship, but also the other side, the suppressor. Thanks.
I couldn't agree more with Paulo Freire also on this. I think really we can conceive of this as a double violence, a violence that has not just two sides, but two directions, that involves all of us in a violent process. So this certainly we can say that some people were benefiting more than others in a first instance, but I guess latest now with the catastrophe that we are all facing, even though we are in a different situation, I wouldn't say that we are all in the same boat, whatever that could mean, but nonetheless, we see that we are all in one way or another affected. It diminishes the enjoyability of living in tremendous terms. So it puts us all in a situation where there is just people that will be losing something. I couldn't agree more with Freire on this point.
Thank you, Professor. I will now take a suggestion and won't put on the camera while I do comment on this a little bit, if I may. I actually agree. We're not so far away from here from kind of master-slave dialectic and the ideas that were already pronounced here. But I'm also glad that one thing that maybe that was a bit missed with some today was actually recommended by you. This is to look at the progress of alienation. Alienation has become again quite an important topic in critical theory, for example, with the work of Rachel Yegi, and even before that, it was of course the question of reification in Hornet and so on. And I do think that these questions do subtly touch the question of property as such, especially since these are all kind of following the famous Lukácsian idea of reification. And of course, the question I asked before, the question of artificial intelligence, the question of giving kind of to say legal rights to the not just to people, but also to kind of different, even machines at what point will need to be considered in that light. We are here really talking about the problem here. And of course, if we talk about property, not just as something material, but mostly as intellectual, as having a world, this comes even more to light. So yeah, I think the recognition and the question of alienation, reification, these are really connected in this light. So, Professor. So if you have any comment on that, otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with Rachel Yegi's work, and I think it was quite significant also in historical terms that this crucial term of social sciences started to disappear with the transformation of the class system in the 70s, where all of a sudden it became unfashionable to think about alienation and reification. So in a way, I think that the first process perhaps was that this term disappeared, that there was no vocabulary of the social sciences anymore in the 70s, 80s onward that referred to experiences of alienation, that made it quite difficult in the recent years also to address phenomena that in a way were linked to reification and alienation. So in that sense, it is definitely paramount to return to some of the words that we have lost, perhaps for specific historical reasons, and to reflect on them again by probably also changing some of their meaning. We could obviously also think of alienation not just in negative terms, but perhaps to a certain extent also in positive terms. I'm thinking also of a conversation between Judith Butler and Athena Athanasiou on dispossessions, another related term, where perhaps, and I'm trying to be as careful as possible, also a certain dispossession of the belief of being in oneself possession could allow us to cultivate also perhaps a new sensibility. Because I guess that to a certain extent, a lot of modern legal and political philosophy, to the extent that it builds upon autonomy, cultivates also a very limited sense of ownership as a self-possession, of possessing one's own life. And perhaps a certain careful dispossession of this very notion could allow us also to cultivate a different sensibility by starting again by oneself, by realizing that perhaps we have always already been alienated, a history that we tend to repress or forget. But what were we at the very beginning, if not absolutely dispossessed of our own, let's say, organs? How did we come even to the point to believe that we can possess who we are or what we are? This is probably also one of the touching points between philosophy and psychoanalysis. But again, it would be bringing coins to Newcastle if I speak about psychoanalysis to philosophers in Ljubljana. So.
I actually kind of like this, because just a few days ago, me and Professor were discussing a bit unrelated stuff, and it was the same thing. So I remembered immediately this question of dispossession, kind of this primordial, like to say, disaffection of humans. So yeah, it's kind of interesting, you know, how we can combine and maybe help even us to understand the terms which do come from a different vocabulary, you know, from maybe a bit of more of this Marxian line, especially, that were most popular in the 20th century. And on the other hand, of course, the long tradition of liberalism. So thank you. I actually think that we are should.
Reingard also has
another question.
Not a question, just a comment. To Andreas, I think the sociologist Hartmut Rosa might agree, saying that the process of alienation through acceleration has also led us to search more for what he calls resonance, because it's made so obvious for us that something is lacking.
I think it would be very problematic if you think of alienation as this kind of solely negative term, a term that recalls, I don't know, perhaps even romantic notion of authenticity, of being true to oneself. So I guess that any critique that addresses phenomena of reification, of alienation, needs to be obviously aware that the consequence cannot be to return to any sense of authenticity, because that wouldn't be any less problematic. So yes, resonances, as Hartmut Rosa calls it, affective relations, perhaps even what we're experiencing nowadays as this kind of contagion between not just us humans, but also non-humans, this virus that proliferates, obviously that endangers us, that is certainly also a reflection of a loss of habitat, but that reflects also a certain history of evolution, because we wouldn't have become what we are if it was not also for viruses proliferating. Brings us also to the attention that we are all in a way connected and disconnected at the same time in a very precarious fashion.
Thank you, Andreas. Now, to avoid the same mistake, so thank you to understand, Reinhard. I will now really ask for the final time to put any questions that you have. I think it was a really lovely evening. I'm extremely glad that Professor was able to join us, but there is still time.
I'll jump in because there seem to be some problems again with Gašper's connection, and I'm asking Tinkara if there are any, if you can see perhaps if there are any questions in the comments below on Facebook. If not, then we'll just say
One more question, one more.
We'll just say herzlichen Dank to Andreas, to all of you, of course, who watched us, and for all the comments. So Tinkara, do we have anything?
No, there is nothing on Facebook. I think that's that.
Okay, so Gašper, are you back to say a final goodbye?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly. I don't understand why you can't hear me. Then I would. Then I'm sure that Tomasz will be able to say goodbye. But can you wave if you can hear me now?
Gašper, I think that the matrix is trying to disown you in a way.
Okay.
So I think I'll just have to.
So yeah, so we did talk about.
Yeah, unfortunately, you are just you've been cut off. So, yeah, thanks everybody. Hvala lepa vsem, ki ste nas spremljali. Še naprej bomo seveda imeli te dogodke, naslednjega že v decembru, vam sporočimo, ko bo na vrsti. So yeah, this was last announcement in Slovenian for our followers that we'll have another session in December. And well, thanks everybody, and also thank you, Gašper. Thank you very much, Dr. Gašper Pirc, our Vice President, for your effort and for organizing this lovely, indeed lovely evening with a wonderful discussion with Andreas.
Thank you. If you can't hear me, I am waving. Otherwise, thank you very much. And thank you for your patience. Thank you, Andreas.
Thank you so much. And hopefully again, perhaps in different circumstances, perhaps so we can shake hands again and transmit other microbes.
Goodbye.